Welcome to The Debate. Today we are dissecting a forecast that predicts a pretty tectonic shift in the artificial intelligence landscape over the next 2 years. We're looking specifically at 2026 and 2027, a window that the source material identifies as creating a looming deficit for the current titans of AI. The monolithic model of development, building bigger, denser, more expensive brains is, well, it's about to hit a wall.
It is a bold prediction. It's arguably a contrarian one. The prevailing narrative for years has been that scale is all that matters, that the company with the most GPUs and the biggest data set simply wins. But the argument we're examining today suggests the opposite, that the economics of intelligence are about to fracture, and the dominance of the massive, generalized large language model, the LLM, is going to be dismantled by a swarm, really, of specialized small language models, or SLMs.
And just so we're clear on the stakes here, I'm arguing that the one model to rule them all strategy is economically toxic, especially for the enterprise. I believe the future belongs to the lean, the local, and the specialized. The giants, and we're talking specifically about OpenAI and Anthropic, are facing an existential crisis because they're selling a Swiss Army knife to people who just need a scalpel.
And that's where I draw the line. I absolutely acknowledge the financial headwinds mentioned in the material. The debt is real, no question. However, I'm here to argue that this idea of the death of the generalist is vastly exaggerated. The value of an LLM isn't just that it knows facts. It's that it possesses reasoning capabilities that span across domains. I believe the conglomerate model of intelligence, where one system can handle diverse tasks, is actually more efficient for the enterprise than trying to stitch together 1,000 fragmented tools.
Well, let's start with the money then, because that is where the cracks are showing first. The source material draws a very, very sharp distinction between the players in this space for that 2026-2027 timeframe. You have the diversified empires, Google and xAI, and then you have the pure plays, OpenAI and Anthropic.
And that distinction is critical. Google is sitting on a cash printing machine called Search. xAI is backed by the entire Tesla and SpaceX ecosystem. They have an infinite runway. OpenAI and Anthropic, despite their massive valuations, are just burning cash on compute and debt service. They are, as the text says, in a cash crunch.
Exactly. And this financial pressure forces them to keep their margins high. They have to sell expensive subscriptions to their massive models just to service that debt. But the market is moving in the exact opposite direction. The material explicitly states that open source and Chinese developers are about to flood the market with SLMs, small language models, that run at a fraction of the cost.
Okay, but I want to unpack that fraction of the cost argument because it's really the hinge of your whole position. When we say SLM, we aren't just talking about a dumber model. We're talking about models with fewer parameters, maybe 7 billion instead of 1 trillion, that require significantly less electricity and hardware to run.
Right. And that cost difference isn't marginal, it's exponential. If I'm a business, why am I paying for a 1 trillion parameter model to process a simple invoice? It makes no sense. And this brings us to the core analogy in the text, which I think is just brilliant. It compares the AI giants to a massive corporate conglomerate. So imagine a single company that tries to sell you healthcare, building construction, restaurant services, lawn care, and accounting all at once.
It paints a picture of bloat, certainly, but, to be fair, conglomerates exist for a reason. Sometimes sharing resources across departments actually creates efficiency.
In the physical world, maybe. But let's look at it from the client side. If you're a CFO, would you hire that conglomerate to do your taxes? Or would you hire a specialized accounting firm that only does accounting? The generalist model is trying to be everything to everyone. It carries the overhead of knowing how to write a sonnet in Elizabethan English while you're just asking it to check for duplicate payments in a spreadsheet. You're paying for the sonnet capability even if you never, ever use it.
I understand the intuitive appeal of the specialist argument. I do. However, I think the analogy is slightly flawed when you apply it to intelligence. Intelligence isn't like lawn care versus healthcare. Reasoning is foundational. The logic that you need to understand a complex legal contract often overlaps with the logic needed to understand a supply chain bottleneck. By fracturing these capabilities into all these isolated LMMs, aren't you losing the emergent benefits of a system that can actually connect the dots across departments?
See, that is the theoretical argument for AGI, for artificial general intelligence. But the source material argues that the enterprise market doesn't care about emergent benefits. They care about workflow execution. They don't need a philosopher. They need a really, really good clerk. I mean, let's look at the specific departments listed: human resources, finance, operations, sales, marketing, IT, customer service, R&D, legal, supply chain. These are distinct silos with distinct rules.
But they interact. Sales impacts supply chain. Legal impacts HR. If you isolate the intelligence, you isolate the data.
They interact, yes, but the tasks are distinct. Let's drill down into finance, which the text highlights. We're talking about invoice data extraction, transaction categorization, bank reconciliation, expense report auditing. These are rigid, rules-based tasks. They don't require connecting the dots between a haiku and a ledger. In fact, creativity in accounting is usually a crime. You want a model that is boring, accurate, and cheap.
Precision, yes. But let's play out the reality of that. If I replace my generalist LLM with a specialist SLM for invoice extraction, and then I get another one for expense auditing, and a third for payroll, I am suddenly managing a whole fleet of disparate software tools. The material describes the giants as having bloated bureaucracies, but what you're proposing is that the client take on the burden of integrating 50 different models. That sounds like an IT nightmare.
I disagree that it increases the burden. In fact, I'd say it reduces the technical debt. The material points out that these SLMs are likely to be fine-tuned on specific datasets. An SLM trained exclusively on 10 years of global invoice formats will hallucinate less and process faster than GPT-5, which is trying to predict the next token based on the entire internet. The burden you're talking about is solved by APIs. The tools don't need to share a brain, they just need to share a database. Precisely, it's the difference between a genius who has read every book in the library but is easily distracted versus a savant who has memorized the tax code and nothing else. For the enterprise, the savant wins every single time. And crucially, the savant is cheaper. The text highlights that specialized fine-tuning leads to higher accuracy. If you're doing purchase order matching, a 1% error rate because the model got confused by a similar concept from a different domain? Well, that's unacceptable.
Okay, let's talk about the cost and the competition again. You mentioned open source and Chinese developers. This is a significant factor in the 2026 forecast. I mean, we are seeing a proliferation of high-quality models coming out of China, DeepSeek, Qwen, and others that are performing at near GPT levels for coding and math, but they're open weights. They're essentially free to download and run.
And that just destroys the moat for OpenAI and Anthropic. Their entire business model relies on renting out their intelligence via an API. But if a Chinese developer or an open source collective releases a model that's 95% as good at coding but costs $0 in licensing, the price floor completely collapses. The giants are servicing massive debt to build the Omni model, while the market is being flooded with free, good enough alternatives.
Good enough is a dangerous phrase in enterprise, though. For a chatbot, sure. But for regulatory compliance monitoring, another task listed right in the text, is 95% good enough? If an SLM misses a compliance violation because it lacks the broader context of a changing geopolitical situation, something a generalist model might know from its news training, that cost savings evaporates instantly in fines.
Actually, the material argues the exact opposite regarding compliance. It cites enhanced data privacy through local deployment as a major advantage for SLMs. This is huge for legal and finance. With a generalist LLM, you're often sending sensitive data to the cloud to OpenAI servers to be processed. Even with enterprise guarantees, that is a risk factor. An SLM is small enough to run locally. You can put it on your own secure server, air-gapped from the internet.
That is a strong point. The ability to run on-premise without needing a massive data center is a distinct advantage of the SLM architecture. You keep your data sovereign.
Right. So if I'm a bank, I can run a compliant SLM inside my own firewall. It's faster, lower latency because there's no network round trip. It's more private, it's cheaper, and it uses less energy. What is the argument for sending that data to a massive energy-hungry model in the cloud?
The argument is adaptability. And this is where I think the bureaucracy critique in the text might be underestimating the giants. Your position and the text position is that it is virtually impossible for OpenAI or Anthropic to pivot. It claims they can't compete in these niche markets because they're too slow and bloated. But these are software companies. They have some of the smartest engineers in the world. Why can't they just, automate the creation of SLMs? Why can't OpenAI offer GPT Finance and GPT HR as specialized slices of their main model?
Because that requires a fundamental pivot in their architecture and their business model at a time when they are drowning in debt. The text calls this the trillion-dollar question. To pivot, they would have to cannibalize their flagship product. They've spent billions convincing the world that bigger is better. To suddenly say, actually, you just need this tiny slice, undermines their entire justification for the massive capital expenditure they just made on those GPU clusters.
That's the classic innovator's dilemma, isn't it? They're trapped by their own investment and scale. But surely they see the writing on the wall. They aren't blind to the open source benchmarks.
They aren't blind, but they might be handcuffed. The text describes their internal structure as a logistical nightmare when it comes to this type of fragmentation. To build a truly competitive purchase order matching model, you need deep domain expertise in supply chain logistics. OpenAI has AI researchers, not supply chain experts. A lean startup that does only supply chain AI will have that domain expertise baked into their DNA. OpenAI cannot replicate that depth across 10,000 different verticals simultaneously.
I concede that domain expertise is a bottleneck. A generalist engineer can't fine-tune a model for molecular biology as well as a biologist can. However, let's look at the technical edge again. We touched on latency. The text mentions real-time transaction categorization.
This is a physics problem. Large models are slow. If you're doing high-frequency trading or real-time fraud detection at a point of sale, you cannot wait 500 milliseconds for a massive model to think. You need sub-50 millisecond response times. An SLM optimized for that specific task can run on the edge, literally on the device or local server, and deliver that speed. The generalist model is simply too heavy. It's like trying to commute to work in a freight train. It's powerful, but it's really hard to park.
So we're moving toward a world where intelligence is a utility, like electricity, but it comes in different voltages for different appliances. The giants are selling high-voltage transmission lines, but most devices just need a AAA battery.
That is a perfect metaphor. And the market for AA batteries is massive. And remember the energy consumption point mentioned in the text? Running a massive model costs a fortune in electricity. Running an SLM costs pennies. As ESG, environmental, social, and governance goals become more important for corporations, the carbon footprint of their AI stack is going to matter. SLMs are the green option.
But here's my concern with the fragmentation future. If every department buys their own specialized SLM from different vendors, a Chinese model for logistics, a French open source model for HR, an American startup for sales, you end up with a chaotic tech stack. The integration nightmare shifts from the vendor to the IT director. The giants offer a unified ecosystem. Google can say, use our models, and everything works together seamlessly. In a corporate environment, the single throat to choke, having one vendor responsible for everything, is a powerful sales pitch.
It was a powerful pitch in the era of Oracle and SAP. But look at the modern SaaS landscape. It's already fragmented. Companies use Salesforce for CRM, Slack for communication, Workday for HR, Jira for project management. They already prefer best-in-class distinct tools over one clunky monolith. The SLM revolution just brings AI into that existing best-in-class architecture.
That's a fair historical parallel. The suite versus best-of-breed debate has been going on for decades. You're arguing AI will just follow the best-of-breed path?
Especially because of the cost. I cannot stress the debt aspect enough. The source material emphasizes that OpenAI and Anthropic are pure-play companies.
They don't have other revenue. If their generalist subscription revenue dips because people switch to cheaper SLLMs, they spiral. Google can afford to lose money on AI to keep you using search. OpenAI cannot. They have to charge a premium, but the SLLMs are racing to the bottom on price.
So for OpenAI and Anthropic, the looming deficit isn't just a metaphor, it's a balance sheet reality. They have to prove that generalization offers a premium value that specialization cannot touch.
And what is that value? For creative writing, sure. For novel scientific discovery, maybe. But for the mundane, operational tasks that make up 90% of enterprise activity, invoice matching, regulatory scanning, route optimization, there is no premium value in generalization. There is only a premium cost.
I want to push back on sales and marketing being a mundane task, though. The text lists it. In marketing, you need cultural nuance. You need to understand idioms, humor, trends. Isn't that where the generalist shines? A tiny model trained only on past ad copy might sound robotic. A large model understands the zeitgeist.
Even there, the fine-tuning argument holds. A massive model understands the global zeitgeist, but a specialized marketing SLM, fine-tuned on your brand-specific voice, your customer personas, and your past successful campaigns, will outperform the generic model. The source material mentions higher accuracy through specialized fine-tuning. In marketing, accuracy means sounding like you, not sounding like a generic corporate bot.
So the SLM acts as a brand guardian in a way the LLM cannot. It's less likely to go rogue because it doesn't know how to go rogue. It only knows your brand guidelines.
Correct. It ensures consistency. A generalist model is prone to drift. One day it sounds formal, the next day casual, depending on the prompt. A specialist model is locked in. And let's look at supply chain again. The text mentions predictive inventory management. That is pure math and pattern recognition based on historical sales data. It doesn't need to know who the president of France is. It just needs to know that when it rains in Seattle, umbrella sales go up. An SLM can learn that correlation instantly and cheaply.
We've covered the economics, the technical specs, and the logistics. I want to circle back to the timeline, 2026 and 2027. This is effectively tomorrow in enterprise development cycles.
It is immediate. The debt comes due soon. The hardware build-out for these massive clusters is happening now, costing billions. If the revenue doesn't materialize because the market fractures into cheap SLMs, the bubble bursts. The giants are banking on a monopoly of intelligence that simply won't exist.
So the trillion-dollar question posed by the material is, what can the AI giants do if your thesis is correct and the conglomerate structure is outdated? Do they have a survival play?
The only play is to cannibalize themselves before someone else does it to them. They need to pivot to becoming platform providers for SLMs rather than just model providers. But that admits defeat on the AGI vision. It admits that superintelligence isn't the product, the infrastructure is.
And that is a hard pill to swallow for companies founded on the mission of creating artificial general intelligence. It reduces them to utility providers. It turns them into the electric company rather than the inventors of the light bulb.
But it might be the only way to avoid the deficit. The text concludes that the dominance of the generalist is ending. The swarm is coming. You can either sell nets to the fishermen, or you can try to be the only fish in the sea while the water dries up.
It is a fascinating pivot point. I remain skeptical that the giants are as helpless as the accounting firm analogy suggests. History shows that big tech is ruthless at acquiring or crushing the swarm. If an SLM architecture proves superior, Google or OpenAI could simply replicate it and bundle it into their offering for free, effectively starving the startups. The integration value I mentioned earlier is a powerful defensive moat. They can just make it easier to use their SLMs than anyone else's.
They can try, but can they do it while servicing billions in debt against a global open source community that works for free? That is the gamble. The bloated bureaucracy argument suggests they can't move fast enough. By the time they launch their supply chain SLM, a startup has already captured the market with a better, cheaper version.
Well, it certainly frames the next 2 years as a battle for the soul of the industry. Will it be centralized and monolithic, or decentralized and fragmented?
My money is on the fragments. The enterprise demands efficiency, and the generalist is inherently inefficient. The deficit is looming and the clock is ticking.
A provocative take, as always.
Whether the conglomerate collapses or adapts remains to be seen, but the rise of the specialist is absolutely a trend we cannot ignore.
That is all the time we have for today. Thank you for listening to The Debate.
Thank you.